Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, January 20th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 76.5 degrees, with a low of 56.9, so expect a mild winter day with plenty of sunshine. Coming up on the show, we'll examine the motivations behind Israel's demolition of the UNRWA headquarters in East Jerusalem, and explore why President Trump is advocating for housing reforms among global elites at the Davos gathering. Plus, other key stories from around the world, including updates on international tensions and economic shifts. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We start this hour in East Jerusalem, where Israeli crews have just torn down the main UNRWA headquarters. Ethan, walk us through what happened there this morning.
Grace, just after 7 a.m. local time today, Israeli demolition crews, backed by police and military, rolled into UNRWA's compound in the Sheikh Jarrah area of East Jerusalem. According to the Associated Press, they sealed off nearby streets, pushed out private security guards, and even took down the United Nations flag, raising an Israeli one in its place. Bulldozers then moved in and began leveling mobile offices and outbuildings across this roughly 11.4-acre site. It is the same compound that has been UNRWA's central hub for the West Bank and Jerusalem operations for decades.
Was the compound still actively used by UNRWA, or had it already been shut down before today?
It had been mostly empty of staff for nearly a year, and Israeli officials are leaning heavily on that point. UNRWA says the place was effectively forced to close because of repeated raids, closures, and broader security concerns since the Israel-Hamas war escalated more than 2 years ago. The Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem is arguing that because UNRWA had, in their words, ceased operations there, the site no longer enjoyed United Nations immunity. But UN officials counter that a temporarily vacated office is still protected under international agreements, so this is not just an old, unused building.
How are Israeli leaders framing what happened, especially those in the current government?
Far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir showed up on site while the bulldozers were working and filmed himself praising the demolition. According to AP and Israeli media, he called it a, quote, holiday for Jerusalem, end quote, and said it was another step in asserting Israeli sovereignty over all of the city. The Foreign Ministry is portraying this as an ordinary enforcement of Israeli law on state land, not a strike at the United Nations. But that narrative is colliding with what we are hearing from UN officials and many governments abroad.
And what's the United Nations saying in response to this?
UN leaders are furious. Secretary General Antonio Guterres had already warned in a letter earlier this month, reported by Al Jazeera and The Hindu, that going ahead with demolition could violate the UN Charter and the 1946 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations. After the bulldozers rolled in today, he reiterated that UN premises are supposed to be, in his word, inviolable, and called the move a dangerous precedent. UNRWA's head for the West Bank, Roland Friedrich, told reporters this was the culmination of 2 years of incitement and pressure against the agency and a clear violation of international law protecting UN facilities.
For people who may only know UNRWA as a name in the news, remind us what this agency actually does.
UNRWA was set up back in 1949 to support Palestinian refugees who were displaced around the time Israel was created. According to the agency, it now provides schooling, healthcare, food aid, and social services to roughly 5.9 million registered refugees across Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. In and around East Jerusalem alone, it has historically served around 200,000 people through schools, clinics, and administrative centers. The Sheikh Jarrah compound that is now being bulldozed was the nerve center that coordinated much of that work in the West Bank and Jerusalem.
So what does losing this specific headquarters mean for Palestinian refugees on the ground?
On a practical level, UNRWA says it becomes much harder to coordinate everything from teacher deployment to medical supply chains in the West Bank. Roland Friedrich told AP the demolition threatens the already fragile delivery of aid and services to some of the region's most vulnerable families. Symbolically, though, Many Palestinians see this as more than just an office building. It was a visible sign in Jerusalem of international recognition of their refugee status and the idea of a right of return. Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini said on social media, in comments picked up by Al Jazeera and The Washington Post, that these moves are clearly aimed at, quote, erasing the Palestine refugee identity, end quote.
You mentioned symbolism. How does the timing today play into that symbolism for Palestinians?
It lands on a raw date. Al Jazeera points out that today's demolition comes on the one-year anniversary of a major Israeli military assault on 3 refugee camps, and just days after a large operation in Hebron that also saw homes and roads destroyed. Critics argue this is part of a broader pattern to reshape the demographic and symbolic landscape of occupied areas, especially East Jerusalem. In their view, taking down UNRWA headquarters on this particular day sends a deliberate message about whose presence is meant to be permanent and whose is not.
Israeli officials have long accused UNRWA of ties to Hamas and other militant groups. How central are those accusations to justifying this demolition?
They are very central to the public argument. Israeli leaders, including Ben-Gvir, have repeatedly labeled UNRWA a, quote, greenhouse for terrorism, end quote, saying the agency allows Hamas influence in schools and facilities. One example Israeli officials point to, according to AP and the Times of Israel, is video from the October 7, 2023 attacks showing a Gaza-based UNRWA social worker involved in abducting an Israeli civilian's body. But critics note that is an individual case in Gaza and not specific evidence about this East Jerusalem headquarters.
Has Israel presented any direct evidence that this particular compound was being used by militants?
So far, no AP and outlets like JNS.org report that Israel has not offered site-specific proof that Hamas or other armed groups operated from the Sheikh Jarrah offices. UNRWA says the compound was mainly administrative and that no weapons caches or militant infrastructure were ever found there. The agency also says it carries out neutrality checks, removes staff suspected of political activity, and shares staff lists with host states, arguing that systemic infiltration would be hard to hide from international oversight.
You mentioned international law. What have global courts said about Israel's obligations toward UNRWA?
Last October, about 3 months ago, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion that The Washington Post and Al Jazeera covered extensively. The judges said Israel's unsubstantiated security concerns could not legally justify obstructing UNRWA's humanitarian work, and that Israel had a duty to facilitate the agency's operations in occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. That opinion leaned on an earlier 2004 ruling that reaffirmed East Jerusalem's status as occupied, despite Israel's claim it has annexed the area. So from the court's perspective, tearing down a UN compound there runs directly against those obligations.
Let's talk about how Israel got to the point of legally authorizing this. What changed in Israeli law?
In late October 2024, about 15 months ago, the Knesset passed 2 key laws that fundamentally rewired the relationship with UNRWA. The Jerusalem Post and Anadolu Agency report that one law banned UNRWA from operating anywhere Israel defines as sovereign territory, which includes annexed East Jerusalem, while another barred Israeli officials from even contacting the agency. That set the stage for raids, utility cutoffs, and eventually today's demolition. Israel also formally canceled a long-standing arrangement from 1967 known as the Kome-Mishelmore Exchange, which had guaranteed protection for UNRWA's staff and property in areas under Israeli control.
That sounds like it also involves a property dispute. Who actually owns the land under that compound?
It is complicated, and that is part of the fight. UNRWA has a lease dating back to 1952 from Jordan, which controlled East Jerusalem at the time, and it has paid a symbolic rent into escrow for decades. The Israel Land Authority, though, says parts of the plot were bought by the Jewish National Fund in 1937 and reverted to the state because of alleged unpaid rent and unauthorized construction. Under an Israeli law from 1970, pre-1948, Jewish property claims in East Jerusalem can be revived, so Israeli officials treat the site as state land, while the UN insists it is an inviolable UN compound under that 1946 Immunity Convention.
Beyond the UN's anger, how are other governments reacting to what happened today?
The backlash has been broad. Turkey's foreign ministry, in comments carried by Daily Sabah, called the demolition a, quote, clear violation, end quote, aimed at erasing Palestinian refugee rights, and urged the international community to take deterrent steps. Jordan, which hosts a large Palestinian refugee population and has a special role over holy sites in Jerusalem, described it as a dangerous escalation and a breach of Israel's duties as an occupying power, according to the New Arab. There is growing talk in diplomatic circles that the UN could move from advisory opinions to seeking a full contentious case at the International Court of Justice, potentially framing the demolition as a war crime under the Geneva Conventions.
You mentioned a broader clampdown on aid groups. How does this demolition fit into that larger pattern?
It is one piece of a much wider squeeze. AP and Al Jazeera report that in recent weeks, Israel revoked licenses for 37 international NGOs, including Doctors Without Borders and the Norwegian Refugee Council, under new rules demanding detailed staff lists, funding disclosures, and bans on what Israel calls delegitimization or boycotts. Dozens more organizations, like CARE, are facing license expirations by the end of this year, threatening services in Gaza and the West Bank during a harsh winter with flooding in camps. When you place today's demolition beside those restrictions, aid agencies see a sustained attempt to shrink independent humanitarian space under the banner of security.
We have also heard about a settlement project planned for that site. What is supposed to replace UNRWA's headquarters now that it is gone?
The Israel Land Authority and Housing Ministry have already outlined plans for roughly 1,440 housing units to expand the Ma'alat Daphne settlement right over what used to be the UN compound. That project was announced in late 2024 and, according to Palestinian outlets like WAFA, is still going through planning stages as of today. Critics, including UNRWA law officials and Palestinian leaders, say this would convert what should be protected UN property in occupied territory into permanent Israeli civilian housing. For them, that is a double blow. It cuts humanitarian access and advances de facto annexation of East Jerusalem.
How does all this collide with the debate over UNRWA's funding, especially from the United States?
Funding has been a political yo-yo for years. According to AP, the United States cut all aid to UNRWA under President Trump in 2018, restored it under President Biden in 2021, and then partially froze it again in 2024 while investigating Israeli claims of militant infiltration. Other donors have sometimes followed Washington's lead, leaving the agency constantly on the edge of financial crisis. Analysts quoted by SF-Gate and The Independent say today's demolition could make some governments more cautious about funding, but it could also spur others to step up, seeing UNRWA as under direct political attack.
Before we let you go, what should we be watching for next after today's demolition?
Two things in particular, Grace. First, whether the UN actually moves to the next legal step and asks the International Court of Justice to open a contentious case, which could drag this into years of litigation and sharper diplomatic fallout. Second, whether there are more actions against UNRWA facilities in Jerusalem, like today's tear gas incident at the agency's vocational school in Kulandia, which Al Jazeera says serves more than 300 young refugees learning trades like tech and welding. That could tell us whether this was a one-off demolition or the front edge of a broader effort to drive the agency out of areas under full Israeli control.
A major escalation with big implications for aid, law, and the future of Jerusalem. Ethan, thanks for breaking it all down for us. President Trump heads to Davos this week, and housing affordability is suddenly center stage. Reporter Chloe Bennett is with us. Chloe, what is the White House promising to talk about on Wednesday?
The president is set to use his World Economic Forum speech this Wednesday, exactly 1 year after his second inauguration, to argue he is tackling high housing costs at home. According to the Associated Press, which has been tracking this across outlets like Yahoo Finance, the speech is meant as a big pivot from a first year dominated by foreign policy and FaceTime with billionaires. The White House is previewing what it calls, quote, aggressive, end quote, ideas to make it easier to buy or build a home. It is a bid to show he is focused on kitchen table issues, even while he is literally on a mountaintop with the global elite.
And that setting is part of the story, right? Why are critics calling this housing pitch from Davos ironic?
Davos is a very expensive alpine resort where, as AP notes, the average ski chalet costs around $4.4 million. So you have the president, who campaigned in 2024 by serving fries at a McDonald's drive-thru to project working-class solidarity, now pledging affordability from a place most Americans will only ever see in photos. Critics quoted by the AP say it captures a broader shift in his second term, more time courting ultra-wealthy allies, less direct relief for families squeezed by rent and mortgages. That contrast is exactly what opponents will hammer as he speaks to CEOs and heads of state about helping people who can barely make rent.
Politically, why does he feel the need to pivot to housing now, after a year mostly about foreign crises and business deals?
The numbers are rough for him. An AP NORC's Center for Public Affairs research survey finds roughly 60% of adults think his policies have made the cost of living worse, including housing, and that cuts across party lines. Only about 16% say he has helped, quote, a lot, end quote, which is a steep drop from nearly half of Americans who felt that way in the spring of his first term. Republican pollster Frank Luntz told AP that voters care more about whether they can afford their own lives than about who the president dinners with in Davos, warning that, quote, billionaires are not popular, end quote, and housing could decide control of Congress this fall.
So let's get into what he is actually proposing. What are the biggest ideas we expect to hear in that Davos speech?
The plan is a mix of demand and supply moves, and housing analysts from places like HousingWire, Realtor.com, and the Urban Institute say that balance really matters. On the demand side, the White House wants to let people tap retirement savings for down payments, let homeowners carry their low pandemic-era mortgage rates to a new house, and lean on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to push mortgage rates down a bit more. There is also talk of very long, 50-year mortgages and a ban on large corporate landlords buying more single-family homes. On the supply side, he will promote using federal land for starter homes, tax credits for building in distressed neighborhoods, and pressure on local governments to loosen zoning rules so more apartments and townhomes can be built.
Let us start with that retirement piece. How would using a 401k for a down payment work, and what are experts saying?
The president is expected to sign an order letting people pull from workplace retirement plans like 401ks, 403bs, and federal thrift plans, without the usual early withdrawal penalty if the money goes to a home down payment. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett has pitched this as a, quote, housing equity, end quote, model, treating a starter home like a retirement asset that grows with the market. But housing economists warn, including Redfin's Daryl Fairweather, that you are trading diversified, liquid savings for one very illiquid asset that can drop in value. If home prices fall, or a homeowner loses their job, they could end up house poor with less to fall back on later in life.
And then there is the idea of portable mortgages. How would taking your 3% rate with you to a new house even work?
During the pandemic, millions of homeowners locked in mortgages around 3 or 4%. And that has frozen the market because they do not want to give those up for a 6% loan. The White House wants lenders to let people transfer that old rate when they move, something Trump aides describe as, quote, unlocking, end quote, the market's lock-in effect. In theory, it could free up more existing homes if owners feel they can afford to move. But mortgage experts, quoted by outlets like HousingWire, say lenders and investors who bought those old loans have not signed on, and it is unclear who would absorb the cost of extending those below-market rates.
The administration has already leaned on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy a lot of mortgages. How much does that really move the needle on rates?
According to analysis cited by Goldman Sachs and Moody's Analytics, directing Fannie and Freddie to buy about $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities has already nudged average 30-year rates down toward 6%. They estimate this kind of support could trim another 10 to 35 basis points off what buyers pay, so maybe a few $dozen a month on a typical payment. That is not nothing, but economists like Mark Zandi of Moody's argue that with a national shortfall of roughly 3 to 4 million homes, cheaper financing mostly lets buyers bid more for the same scarce houses. In that situation, sellers can simply raise asking prices to capture the benefit.
The White House had hyped 50-year mortgages as a game changer. Where does that stand now?
Trump floated 50-year loans as a way to shrink monthly payments by roughly 10%, giving first-time buyers more breathing room. But as the National Taxpayers Union's Tommy Aiello told reporters, the trade-off is brutal people build equity much more slowly and can end up paying more than double the home's price in interest over the life of the loan. The idea has reportedly been put on pause after internal pushback and negative coverage. It may still get a shout-out in Davos, but more as something being studied than a done deal.
Another headline item is banning big investors from buying single-family homes. What would that do, and how big a factor are these companies really?
The president has been testing that line on the trail, saying, quote, "People live in homes, not corporations," end quote, and promising to bar large investors who own hundreds or thousands of houses from buying more. The goal is to take some competition out of the market for starter homes, especially in places like Atlanta or Phoenix, where Wall Street landlords are very visible. But research from AEI's Edward Pinto and the Brookings Institution shows these big firms still own only about 1 to 3% of all single-family homes nationwide. Analysts at the Libertarian Reason Foundation and at TD Cowen warn that banning them could actually reduce, quote, "build to rent," end quote, construction and tighten rental supply, especially for families who are not ready or able to buy.
Let us talk about the supply-side message he is expected to deliver. What is in this, quote, "homes for people," end quote, push?
According to reporting in Forbes and investor notes from A-Invest and Norada Real Estate, Interior has been told to identify federal land near expensive metros, especially in western states like Nevada and Arizona, that could be sold cheaply for entry-level developments. The administration also backs the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would give tax credits to investors or builders who take on projects in distressed areas where it costs more to build than you can sell a house for. On top of that, Trump wants to standardize building codes and tie some federal infrastructure money to looser local zoning, nudging cities to allow more duplexes, small apartments, and townhomes instead of only detached houses. Free market groups like the Mercatus Center say those zoning incentives could add meaningful supply, but mostly over 7 to 10 years, not in time to bail out today's buyers.
You mentioned costs and labor are big obstacles. How do tariffs and immigration policy collide with this building agenda?
Construction groups and left-leaning think tanks like the Center for American Progress have pointed out that Trump's own tariffs on imported lumber, steel, and aluminum from places like Canada and Mexico are adding between $17,000 and $522,000 to the cost of building a typical new home. One firm, Cotality, estimates that higher material costs could stop as many as 450,000 new units from being built by the end of the decade. At the same time, his mass deportation plans would hit an industry that relies heavily on immigrant labor, even as there is already a shortage of roughly 349,000 construction workers. It is a genuine policy paradox. The same president promising more homes is making it harder and more expensive to put a crew and materials on a job site.
Pulling back, when you talk to economists, do they think this whole package will actually make homes more affordable anytime soon?
The consensus from nonpartisan experts at the Urban Institute, the AEI Housing Center, and Realtor.com is that these moves might tweak the margins, but will not restore pre-2020 affordability on their own. Demand-side ideas like retirement withdrawals and cheaper mortgages mostly give buyers more firepower in a market that is still millions of homes short. Supply moves like federal land auctions and zoning carrots can help, but they roll out slowly and are being undermined by tariffs and labor squeezes. Capital Economics still expects prices to rise around 4% this year, and Realtor.com's Jake Krimmel summed it up by calling the package, quote, politically attractive, end quote, but structurally too small to close the gap.
And what about renters, who are not in the market to buy at all?
That is one of the big holes here. Aside from hoping that more construction eventually cools rents, there is very little targeted relief for tenants in this agenda. Some analysts, including Jarrett Seiberg at TD Cowen and Chris Salviati at Apartment List, warn that clamping down on large rental investors could actually mean fewer new rental communities get built. So for renters facing steep annual increases, the Davos speech may sound more like a homeowner's plan than a lifeline.
Meanwhile, the AP keeps emphasizing the president's relationship with billionaires. What has that looked like during this second term?
Reporters Josh Boak and his colleagues at AP describe a first year filled with elite networking, a White House dinner last September with Bill Gates, Apple's Tim Cook, Google co-founder Sergey Brin, and Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, whom Trump praised as a, quote, high IQ group, end quote. There were trips to the Middle East and Asia framed around factory and job announcements, along with frequent shout-outs to NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, whose net worth Forbes pegged at well over $160 billion last week. He has appointed wealthy allies like Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and real estate magnate Steve Witkoff, and at one point tapped Elon Musk to help drive federal payroll cuts before a public falling out and reconciliation. Just last month, he celebrated Michael Dell's multi-billion-dollar donation to child investment accounts branded with Trump's name, positioning it as a fix for inequality while also spotlighting his billionaire Rolodex.
And when you put that next to the data on inequality, what picture do economists see?
Federal Reserve figures show that since 2017, the top 0.1% of Americans have gained nearly $12 trillion in net worth, bringing their total close to $23.5 trillion, while the bottom half of households added less than $3 trillion combined. Brookings scholar Daryl West told AP that deregulation of finance and artificial intelligence, tax cuts tilted upward, and softer IRS enforcement all disproportionately benefit the wealthy, arguing that, quote, most billionaires do not share the interests of the working class, end quote. Trump's signature tax and wage package, which he calls the, quote, one big beautiful bill, end quote, offers tip and overtime tax breaks that the Congressional Budget Office says could save a typical middle-class family $800 to $1,200 a year. But the Tax Policy Center finds the top 10% see average gains of more than $13,000 and millionaires over $66,000, prompting Alex Jacques of the liberal Groundwork Collaborative to accuse Trump of siding with, quote, investors and billionaires at Davos, end quote, while many families remain one rent hike away from crisis.
There is also a lot happening overseas. Could foreign policy and even his Greenland talk overshadow this housing push in Davos?
Very possibly. The AP notes that with wars in Gaza and Ukraine, turmoil in Venezuela, and Trump once again teasing the idea of buying Greenland in a way he suggested would make Davos, quote, very interesting, end quote, European allies are already on edge. Those flashpoints are likely to dominate hallway conversations and press questions. If his speech turns into a referendum on his global agenda rather than his housing blueprint, the domestic message he is trying to sharpen could easily get drowned out.
Some people blame billionaires and foreign investors directly for high housing costs. What does the research actually show there?
Studies from Wharton and Goldman Sachs suggest institutional and foreign capital have pushed up home prices, but much less than the politics imply, probably less than about 1.5% to 2% of the total run-up. The bigger drivers they identify are old-fashioned constraints, too few homes built for too long, tight zoning, labor shortages, and higher material costs, including from tariffs. In some cities, like parts of Atlanta, big landlords have outsized local impact, but nationally they are still a small piece of the puzzle. That is why experts at the AEI Housing Center describe sweeping investor bans as, quote, political theater, end quote, that may look tough in a Davos speech, but do not solve the underlying shortage.
As we look ahead to Wednesday, what will you be listening for that tells us whether this is more than just theater?
I will be watching whether he leans into the working class persona from his campaign or the dealmaker surrounded by billionaires, and whether he puts clear timelines and numbers on new housing starts, not just on mortgage gimmicks. I will also listen for any willingness to revisit tariffs or immigration enforcement, because without tackling costs and labor, the supply-side promises ring hollow to many economists. And then the real test comes later this year. Do people feel their rent or payment ease up before they vote in the midterms? Or does housing remain a symbol of the gap between Davos rhetoric and everyday reality?
We will leave it there. Reporter Chloe Bennett, thanks for walking us through what to expect from Davos and what it could mean for Americans back home. Here are some other headlines. In Texas, tension is reaching a breaking point. Advocacy groups are demanding a full and transparent probe into Camp East Montana, the sprawling tent complex at Fort Bliss in El Paso, after 3 detainees died there in just 6 weeks. The latest, 36-year-old Victor Manuel Diaz, was found dead January 14th in what officials call a presumed suicide, while another recent death, that of Geraldo Lunas Campos, is being investigated as a possible homicide involving neck and chest compression. This comes as reports describe substandard conditions, from scarce clean water to limited medical care, amid a 107% jump in daily arrests over the past year and a shift from border enforcement to large-scale interior deportations. A new Department of Homeland Security rule now requires members of Congress to give 7 days notice before visiting ICE facilities, a policy a federal judge declined to block, prompting critics to warn that, no notice, inspections have been detained along with the migrants. With DHS funding set to expire January 30th, access, accountability, and the future of these tent cities are becoming the hot potatoes in a very cold budget fight, pitting Secretary Kristi Noem and Governor Greg Abbott against civil rights advocates and northern governors like Tim Walz. On the economic front, the Supreme Court will hear arguments Wednesday in Trump versus Cook, and the Fed is literally in the building. Chair Jerome Powell plans to attend as President Trump seeks to fire Governor Lisa Cook over mortgage fraud accusations she denies, and lower courts found insufficient for removal. The legal question: what counts as cause to sack a Federal Reserve governor under the Fed Act? The outcome could give the White House far more leverage over interest rate setters, turning independent central bank into a more conditional clause. Powell's rare courtroom cameo follows his sharp criticism of Justice Department subpoenas as political pretexts, setting the stage for a high-stakes showdown over who really gets to be fed up. In Paris, the race for France's future is on appeal. Marine Le Pen appeared before a 3-judge panel January 20th as she challenges a conviction for allegedly diverting nearly €5 million in EU funds through parliamentary aids. The 2025 verdict gave her a 5-year ban from public office, currently sidelining her from the 2027 presidential race. Le Pen now argues any hiring missteps were unintentional, insisting her party never concealed anything. The trial runs through mid-February, with a summer ruling expected to decide whether Le Pen can stage yet another bid or whether protégé Jordan Bardella becomes the National Rally's standard-bearer. Upheld charges could end her 3-decade career. A lighter sentence under 2 years could reopen the Élysée door, and allies abroad are already casting the case as lawfare, not fair play. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN is giving Myanmar's generals a cold electoral shoulder. The regional bloc will neither send official observers nor certify the 3-stage election now underway, under military rule, an exercise marked by very low turnout and domination by the junta-aligned Union Solidarity and Development Party. The decision cites the exclusion of major opposition forces, undercutting claims of a democratic reset and keeping pressure on the junta under the 5-point consensus. But unity is on thin ice. Countries like Cambodia and Vietnam have dispatched their own observers, complicating efforts by this year's chair, the Philippines, to speak with one voice, while Myanmar's civil war rages. And at the bottom of the world, penguins are on the move and on the clock. A decade-long study in the Journal of Animal Ecology finds Antarctic penguins advancing their breeding seasons by up to 2 weeks, the fastest timing shift ever recorded in a vertebrate. Gen 2 penguins are nesting about 13 days earlier per decade, while Adelie and chinstrap colonies have jumped forward by around 10 days, as breeding sites warm 4 times faster than the wider Antarctic, with temperatures rising roughly 3 degrees Celsius in just 10 years. The change risks a dangerous mismatch between hatching chicks and peak supplies of krill and phytoplankton, turning the Southern Ocean into a buffet that opens late for some species and early for others. Gen 2s, the adaptable early birds, are expanding, while more specialized Adelies and chinstraps face shrinking habitat and heightened competition, with some models warning they could vanish by century's end. As bellwethers of Antarctic health, their accelerated love lives may be the clearest sign yet that the ecosystem is slipping from ice to crisis, with consequences that ripple through global nutrient cycles. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.